The Eternal City at Twilight. *A Sleep Story of Ancient Rome*. Scene, the golden hour on the Palatine. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long ribbons of amber and rose across the vast expanse of the Eternal City. The light fell softly upon the red-tiled rooftops, warming the pale travertine stone of temples and basilicas until they seemed to glow from within, like embers settling into the quietude of evening. A gentle breeze drifted in from the distant Tiber, carrying with it the faint mineral smell of the river and the last warmth of a summer day that had stretched long and golden across the ancient capital. On the Palatine Hill, where the grandest houses of Rome stood sentinel over the sprawling city below, an old gardener named Marcus moved slowly among the cypress trees and flowering oleanders of a senator's private garden. His sandals made soft, rhythmic sounds against the mosaic pathways, and his weathered hands brushed tenderly against the silvery leaves of olive branches as he passed. He had tended these grounds for more than 40 years, and every tree, every sculpted hedge, every trickling fountain had become as familiar to him as the lines upon his own palms. The garden was a place of profound stillness in these early evening hours. The household slaves had finished their daily tasks and retreated to the cool shade of the servants' quarters, while the senator and his family had departed for a dinner engagement across the city. Marcus had the entire terraced paradise to himself, and he moved through it with the unhurried grace of one who has learned that the world reveals its deepest beauty only to those who pause to receive it. He stopped beside a small fountain carved in the likeness of Neptune, the sea god's stone face worn smooth by decades of water cascading gently over his features. The sound of the water was like a whispered lullaby, soft and continuous, falling into a basin lined with blue and white tiles that had been imported long ago from the shores of distant Greece. Marcus lowered himself onto a marble bench beside the fountain and allowed his eyes to rest upon the panorama of Rome stretching out below him. From this vantage point, he could see the great Forum Romanum, its columns and monuments bathed in the deepening light of sunset. The Temple of Saturn, with its 8 remaining columns, stood as it had stood for centuries, a testament to the enduring spirit of the city. Beyond it, the Basilica Julia stretched along the south side of the Forum, its arches casting long shadows across the worn paving stones where generations of Romans had walked, argued, loved, and dreamed. The sounds of the city rose up to meet him, but they were muted by distance and softened by the settling peace of evening. He could hear the faint calls of vendors closing their stalls in the markets below, the distant laughter of children being called home for supper, the gentle bells of goats being led back to their pens outside the city walls. Somewhere, a mother was singing to her infant, and though Marcus could not make out the words, the melody drifted up to him like smoke from a distant hearth, sweet and somnolent and achingly familiar. The old gardener closed his eyes and breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the perfume of the garden, the honeyed sweetness of jasmine, the sharp green scent of freshly trimmed boxwood, the dusty warmth of sun-baked stone. He had lived his entire life within sight of these 7 hills, and yet the beauty of Rome at twilight never failed to fill him with a quiet wonder, a gentle gratitude for the simple gift of being alive in such a place, at such an hour, in such profound and settling peace. Scene, the Baths of Agrippa. As the sky deepened from gold to soft violet, a young scribe named Claudia made her way through the winding streets of the Campus Martius toward the great Baths of Agrippa. She walked slowly, savoring the cool evening air after a long day of copying manuscripts in the dim lamplight of her employer's study. Her eyes were tired, and her fingers still bore the faint stains of iron gall ink, but her spirit lifted with each step as she drew nearer to the bathhouse, where she knew warmth and rest awaited her. The baths were quieter at this hour, when most of the city's citizens had already completed their daily ablutions and departed for their evening meals. Claudia preferred it this way. The vast halls felt almost sacred in their emptiness, the echoing splash of water against marble creating a kind of music that seemed to belong to some other, more peaceful world. She passed through the entrance and into the great apoditerium, the changing room where niches lined the walls for the storage of clothing and personal items. A few other late bathers moved about in the soft lamplight, their voices hushed and their movements slow, as if the very atmosphere of the place demanded a certain reverence. Claudia found an empty niche and carefully folded her simple tunic, placing her worn leather sandals beneath it. The first room she entered was the frigidarium, the cold bath chamber, where a large pool of cool water shimmered beneath the high-vaulted ceiling. Mosaic dolphins and sea creatures danced across the floor beneath her feet, their tiny colored tiles catching the light of oil lamps set into the walls. Claudia did not linger here tonight. The chill of the water was bracing, meant to close the pores and invigorate the body, but she paused for a moment to appreciate the beauty of the space, the way the light played across the surface of the water like moonlight on a calm sea. She moved on to the tepidarium, the warm room that served as a gentle transition between cold and hot. Here, the air was pleasantly heated by the hypercourse system that ran beneath the floors, the same ingenious Roman engineering that had made such luxurious bathing possible for citizens of every station. Claudia settled onto a warm marble bench and allowed the heat to seep into her tired muscles, her eyes drifting closed as the tension of the day began to melt away. The sounds around her were soft and soothing, the distant splash of water, the murmured conversations of other bathers, the gentle hiss of steam rising from heated stones. The walls of the tepidarium were painted with scenes of gardens and fountains, idealized landscapes where eternally still trees cast eternally cool shadows over paths that led nowhere and everywhere. Claudia let her gaze wander across these painted paradises, her mind growing quiet and still. After a time, she rose and made her way to the caldarium, the hot bath chamber, where steam hung thick in the air and the heat embraced her like a warm blanket. The pool here was smaller, the water almost too hot to bear at first, but as she lowered herself slowly into its depths, her body adjusted and the warmth became a kind of gentle blessing, penetrating deep into her bones and washing away the last traces of fatigue. She floated there in the quiet, her hair drifting around her like dark seaweed, her arms spread wide to embrace the water's warmth. Above her, the domed ceiling was pierced by a single oculus, an opening to the sky through which she could see the first stars of evening beginning to appear. They twinkled down at her like distant lights in a vast and peaceful darkness, and she thought of all the Romans who had floated in these same waters over the centuries, gazing up at these same eternal stars. The steam rose around her in lazy spirals, carrying with it the faint scent of olive oil and fragrant herbs. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft voices of the bath attendants preparing to close for the night, but there was no urgency in their movements, no rush to disturb the sacred calm of this place. Claudia closed her eyes and let herself drift, suspended between water and air, between wakefulness and dreams, as the great city of Rome settled into the peaceful embrace of night. Scene, the baker's final loaves. In a narrow street near the foot of the Aventine Hill, where the workshops of craftsmen and tradesmen clustered together in companionable proximity, an old baker named Gaius was removing the last loaves of the day from his great brick oven. The heat radiating from the oven mouth was still considerable, though the fires had been allowed to die down hours ago, and Gaius moved with the practiced ease of one who had performed this same task thousands upon thousands of times over the course of a long and honest life. The loaves emerged golden brown and fragrant, their crusts crackling softly as they met the cooler air of the bakery. Gaius placed them carefully on a worn wooden table, arranging them in neat rows to cool before he would wrap them in clean linen and set them aside for the morning's customers. The bread was simple fair, round loaves stamped with his mark, made from wheat flour and leavened with sourdough starter that his grandfather had first cultivated nearly a century ago. The bakery was quiet now, the heavy stone millstones that had ground grain into flour all day long finally at rest. A single oil lamp burned on a shelf near the window, casting a warm glow across the flour-dusted surfaces and the baskets of risen dough waiting for tomorrow's baking. Outside, the street had grown dark and still, the shops of neighboring merchants shuttered and silent, their proprietors long since departed for home and hearth. Gaius wiped his floury hands on his apron and moved to the doorway, leaning against the frame as he gazed out at the peaceful evening. The air smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke, of the nearby tanner's district with its sharp animal scents, of the wild herbs that grew in the cracks between paving stones. A cat padded silently past, its eyes glowing briefly in the lamplight before it disappeared into the shadows. From somewhere above, the baker could hear the soft murmur of voices, a family sharing their evening meal in one of the apartments that rose several stories above his shop. The sound was comforting in its ordinariness, a reminder that all around him, in countless homes throughout the vast city, people were gathering together as they had gathered for generations, breaking bread and sharing stories, finding comfort in the simple rituals of daily life. Gaius thought about his own family, his wife who had passed peacefully 5 winters ago, his sons who now ran their own bakeries in other quarters of the city, his grandchildren who sometimes visited on festival days, their small hands eager to help shape the dough into loaves and rolls. He missed them, but it was a gentle missing, softened by years and by the certain knowledge that the bonds of family did not weaken with distance or time. He returned to the cooling loaves and began the familiar work of wrapping them, his hands moving in the old rhythms as his mind drifted into a pleasant, hazy stillness. The linen cloths were soft and worn from many washings, and they folded around the warm bread like embracing arms. One by one, the loaves were tucked away in their baskets, ready to nourish the bodies and spirits of his neighbors when the sun rose again over Rome. When the work was finished, Gaius extinguished the oil lamp and made his way up the narrow wooden stairs to his small living quarters above the shop. His bed was simple, a straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame, covered with a woolen blanket that his wife had woven in the early years of their marriage, but it welcomed him like an old friend. He settled onto it with a contented sigh, listening to the distant sounds of the city as it drifted toward sleep, the bark of a dog, the cry of a night bird, the soft footsteps of a watchman making his rounds through the darkened streets. The room smelled of bread and flour and the faint sweetness of the dried lavender that hung in bunches from the ceiling beams. Gaius closed his eyes and felt the deep weariness of honest labor settle into his bones, a weariness that was not unpleasant but rather a kind of blessing, a promise that sleep would come easily and carry him gently through the night. Outside his small window, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, the same stars that had witnessed the founding of this great city and would witness its distant future, keeping their silent vigil over all who slumbered below. Scene, the temple steps at midnight. The great temple of Vesta stood silent beneath the midnight sky, its sacred flame burning low within the circular sanctuary where it had burned without interruption for centuries beyond counting. The Vestal virgins who tended this eternal fire had completed their evening rituals and retired to their house nearby, leaving the temple precinct wrapped in a profound and sacred stillness. A young priest named Lucius sat on the worn marble steps that led up to the temple entrance, his white robes pooling around him like spilled milk in the darkness. He was not supposed to be here at this hour. His duties had ended with the sunset prayers, but something had drawn him out of his bed and through the sleeping city to this place, this quiet center of an ancient faith. The Forum stretched out before him, its monuments reduced to silhouettes against the star-scattered sky. The great Basilica Aemilia loomed to his left, its arched windows dark and empty. To his right, the Regia, the ancient seat of the kings who had ruled Rome before the Republic, sat low and humble, a reminder of how much had changed since the first settlement had risen on these hills. And yet, Lucius thought, how much remained the same. The stars overhead were the same stars that Romulus and Remus had gazed upon. The stones beneath his feet had been walked by countless generations of Romans, each one carrying their own hopes and fears, their own small joys and sorrows. The sacred flame behind him had been kindled from the same source that the first Vestals had tended, passed down through an unbroken chain of devotion that stretched back to the very dawn of the city. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of the sacred laurel trees that grew in the temple precinct and the distant fragrance of gardens on the nearby Palatine. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, creating a gentle rustling that was almost like a whispered prayer. Lucius pulled his robes more tightly around his shoulders and felt a deep peace settling into his heart, a sense of connection to something vast and eternal that transcended the boundaries of his own brief life. He thought about the nature of faith, about the way it could sustain a person through hardship and loss, through the long years of uncertainty that made up a human life. The gods of Rome were many, Jupiter with his thunderbolts, Mars with his warrior strength, Venus with her gifts of love and beauty, but beneath all their varied forms, Lucius sensed a single animating presence, a force of life and order that held the cosmos together like the hidden strings of a great celestial lyre. The flame within the temple flickered gently, visible through the open doorway as a soft orange glow against the darkness. It was such a small thing, really, a simple fire that required constant tending, constant care, and yet it represented something immense, the enduring spirit of a civilization that had grown from a tiny village of shepherds and farmers into the greatest power the world had ever known. Lucius did not know how long he sat there, watching the stars trace their slow arcs across the heavens, listening to the soft sounds of the sleeping city. Time seemed to lose its meaning in the sacred stillness of that place, each moment stretching out into eternity before gently folding into the next. His eyelids grew heavy, and his thoughts softened into dreams, and the boundary between waking and sleeping became as thin and permeable as smoke. When at last he rose to return to his quarters, the eastern sky had begun to show the faintest hint of grey, the first suggestion of the dawn that would soon break over Rome. But for now, the city still slept, wrapped in the peaceful darkness of night, and Lucius carried that peace with him as he walked slowly through the empty streets, his footsteps echoing softly against the ancient stones. Scene. The harbour at Ostia. Far from the 7 hills, at the mouth of the Tiber where the great river met the sea, the port city of Ostia lay quiet beneath the stars. The harbour was filled with ships of every size and description, great grain freighters from Egypt, merchant vessels from Carthage and Greece and the distant shores of Hispania, all of them rocking gently at anchor, their masts swaying in slow rhythm like a forest of leafless trees stirred by an invisible wind. On the deck of one such ship, a Greek trader named Alexandros sat wrapped in a woolen blanket, watching the lights of Ostia flicker along the shoreline. He had spent many months at sea, traveling from port to port across the vast Mediterranean, and tomorrow he would begin the final leg of his journey up the Tiber to Rome itself, where his cargo of olive oil and fine pottery would fetch handsome prices in the markets of the capital. But for now, there was only this moment, the gentle rocking of the ship beneath him, the soft lapping of waves against the hull, the salt smell of the sea mingling with the sweeter scents of the river and the distant land. Alexandros breathed deeply and felt the exhaustion of his long voyage settling into his bones, a weariness that was not unpleasant but rather a kind of earned rest, a reward for the many miles he had traveled. The sea had been his home for most of his adult life. He had learned to read the moods of wind and water as easily as other men read the expressions on human faces. He knew the particular blue of calm seas and the ominous green of approaching storms. He had watched dolphins racing alongside his ship at dawn and seen the great whales breaching in the distance, their massive bodies rising from the depths like islands emerging from the waves. Tonight, the sea was peaceful, its surface smooth as polished marble, reflecting the stars above in rippling patterns of silver light. The moon had not yet risen, but the sky was bright with constellations, Orion the Hunter, the Great Bear, the wandering planets that the Romans named after their gods. Alexandros had navigated by these stars many times, trusting their eternal positions to guide him safely across the trackless waters. On the shore, he could see the dark silhouette of the great warehouses where grain from Egypt was stored before being transported to feed the hungry millions of Rome. He could make out the lighthouse at the harbour entrance, its beacon reduced to a dim glow at this late hour. And beyond everything, rising faintly against the eastern sky, he could just glimpse the distant hills of Rome, the heart of the empire that had brought order and prosperity to the known world. Alexandros thought about all the peoples he had encountered in his travels, the proud Egyptians with their ancient monuments, the cultured Greeks from whom his own ancestors had descended, the fierce Carthaginians who had once challenged Rome for supremacy, the mysterious peoples of the distant East who traded in silk and spices and stories of lands beyond imagining. All of them were connected now, linked by the great web of Roman roads and shipping lanes that spread across the world like the threads of a vast and intricate tapestry. The ship rocked gently, and Alexandros felt his eyes growing heavy. He pulled the woolen blanket more tightly around his shoulders and settled back against a coil of rope, letting the motion of the water carry him toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new wonders to behold. But tonight, there was only rest, only the ancient rhythm of sea and sky, only the deep and abiding peace of a world preparing for sleep. Scene, the city dreams . And so the night deepened over Rome, over her 7 hills and her countless monuments, over her temples and markets and humble homes. The eternal city, which by day hummed with the energy of 1,000,000 souls, now lay still and quiet beneath the stars, dreaming the dreams of generations. In the great houses on the Palatine, senators and their families slept on beds of carved ivory and cushions stuffed with goose down, their rooms fragrant with incense and fresh flowers. In the cramped apartments of the Suburra, workers and craftsmen rested on simpler pallets, their children curled beside them like puppies in a basket. In the barracks outside the city walls, legionnaires snored in their bunks, their weapons cleaned and ready, their dreams perhaps filled with memories of distant campaigns or hopes of peaceful retirement. The Tiber flowed on, as it had flowed since before the first stones were laid, its dark waters carrying the reflections of stars and the occasional late-night fisherman's boat. The great aqueducts that brought water from the distant hills continued their work, their channels filled with the endless flow that sustained the life of the city. The roads that led out in every direction lay empty now, but by morning they would be busy again with travelers and merchants, soldiers and messengers, all the countless movements that kept the empire alive. Marcus the gardener slept peacefully in his small room behind the senator's house, his dreams filled with flowers and fountains. Claudia the scribe had returned to her modest lodgings, her body still warm and relaxed from her evening at the baths, her mind already composing the letters she would copy tomorrow. Gaius the baker slept above his shop, the smell of bread wrapping around him like a blessing. Lucius the priest had returned to his quarters beside the temple, the memory of the sacred flame still glowing in his thoughts. And far away, at the harbor of Ostia, Alexandros the trader drifted on the gentle waves, dreaming of home and sea and all the ports that lay between. The night watchmen made their rounds through the sleeping streets, their footsteps soft and steady, their presence a quiet reassurance that all was well. The sacred fires burned low in the temples, tended by those whose duty it was to keep them alive through the long hours of darkness. The cats prowled the alleyways, hunting the mice that fed on fallen grain. The owls called from the rooftops, their voices soft and mournful, ancient sounds that had echoed over these hills since before Rome was Rome. And above it all, the stars wheeled slowly across the vault of heaven, the same stars that had shone down on the first shepherds who had settled these hills, the same stars that would shine down on generations yet unborn. They kept their eternal watch over the sleeping city, over all who rested beneath their light, over all the dreams and hopes and quiet prayers that rose like incense into the peaceful night. The great city breathed slowly, deeply, in and out, like a vast and gentle creature settling into slumber. The sounds of night grew softer, more distant, until they seemed to come from somewhere far away, from another world altogether. The light faded, the shadows deepened, and Rome drifted peacefully into the arms of sleep, cradled by the hills that had held her since the beginning of time. And in this deep and ancient peace, there was nothing to fear, nothing to worry about, nothing to do but rest and dream, and let the night carry you gently toward the dawn that would come, as it had always come, as it would always come, soft and golden over the eternal city. Rest now. Sleep well. The stars are keeping watch, and all is quiet, all is calm, all is at peace in the city of Rome.